Let's begin the class with a short prayer. Father, we ask that you build our courage for the situation in which we live. Let us all benefit in one way or another from this. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Last class, what we were talking about was the relationship between Augustine and Jerome. Jerome had been assigned the task of translating the Bible from Hebrew and from Greek into Latin. And he wanted to translate the Jewish scriptures out of the original Hebrew, and St. Augustine wanted him to translate it out of the Greek. And probably the basis of this particular fight is that because Augustine did not know Hebrew, if Jerome translated it out of Hebrew and he had any questions about it, he would have to ask Jerome. He couldn't rely on his own education. Whereas if he translated it out of Greek, Augustine was a master of Greek. And so it could well have been a question about that. But to be honest, this actually is the source of the conflict about the number of books that's been traditionally part of the Catholic and the Protestant communities. At a certain point in the Jewish history, the Jews really stopped using Hebrew, and the Hebrew's descendant, which is Arabic and Aramaic, became the common languages, and their scriptures they used in Greek. They used that Greek translation we talked about, the Septuagint. And there were several books that entered the Bible after that period, like Maccabees and some of the wisdom books. And those came into the Jewish community in Greek. And at the time of Jerome's translation, there were several books that the original Hebrew had been lost. One of the books of Maccabees, I don't know which one, was originally in Hebrew, but in the days of Jerome, that original didn't exist. The only thing they knew was the Greek one. The only one they knew was the Greek. So they didn't know there was a Hebrew. So Jerome didn't want to use those books. I should mention in the Qumran, we have found all the books that are in the Catholic Bible. All the books have been found there among the scrolls, with the exception of the book of Esther. The book of Esther does not exist among the manuscripts yet. They're still putting together the manuscripts. So anyway, this argument went back and forth between Jerome and Augustine, and for us, it is crucial to how many books you ended up in the Bible. But anyway, Augustine's final argument to Jerome was, Augustine said, is it possible that God would have allowed us for 400 years to be using the wrong books? Because those books are in the Septuagint, which is what they were using. And Jerome ceded that no, that was not possible. So Jerome went on and translated those books that were originally in Greek from Greek, and then the ones from the Hebrew he translated from Hebrew itself. Now, ultimately, it's going back to that conflict where Luther decided to drop the books so that there are less books in the Protestant edition of the Jewish scriptures than there are in the Catholic. So the number of books ended up the number in the Septuagint. One rule that Jerome made became very, very important in the church, and it's extremely important today, although it was ignored for a long time. But Jerome said that any Bible translation must use the most ancient available text from the original languages. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was in the seminary, probably the finest Bible in the world was the Jerusalem Bible that had been translated, and it was in French. And the reason why it was so good was the footnotes were tremendous. There are some pages in the Jerusalem Bible where the footnotes are longer than the amount of text itself. Just an excellent Bible. And everyone wanted that in English, but it's against the rules of the church to translate a Bible from French to English. So what they had to do was get a commission together, and the commission translated the Jewish scriptures from the most available Hebrew transcripts, and they translated the Christian scriptures from the most available Greek transcripts, and then added the notes later. But it was several years before we got the Jerusalem Bible in English because of that. And the difficulty is that when a text is translated, let's say from Hebrew to Greek, there are some decisions made about words because they're not exactly the same between any two languages. And then you translate it from Greek to Latin, and then you translate from Latin to English. It can be very far removed from the original text. So we try not to do that. Another thing that goes on today is because of the work being done on the Dead Sea Scrolls, we end up with newer examples of very old manuscripts rather frequently. They translated all the Dead Sea Scrolls that were big enough to put the pieces together. I think you know that the scrolls became rather crisp, and they're all broken up. But they have barrels of pieces the size of postage stamps, and they just figured out about 5-6 years ago how to figure out them. And what they did was take the DNA off all the little pieces because they're on sheepskins. And so they get the DNA and they know all the little pieces that come from one sheep. And so they have a smaller group of pieces to work from, and they're putting together. But we're going to get a whole bunch more scrolls in time. And when we do that, I have no doubt they'll have to retranslate many of the books in the Jewish Bible. So thanks to things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've often discovered that many of the books that Jerome was against because they were originally in Greek, as I mentioned, are in fact originally in Hebrew. We discovered them in the scrolls. Jerome's final translation became known as the Latin Vulgate. And the reason why they used the term Vulgate was it was a low Latin, a vulgar Latin. And I think you know that if, I don't know if it's so much true now in novels I read, but years ago when I was in college, the English that you would use in writing a novel was not the English we would use in speech. It was very, very different. And now it seems that novels are more likely, because they include a lot of dialogue, but they're more likely to be the type of English we use. But in the ancient world, they didn't like that at all. So the Latin Vulgate was considered a vulgar translation. And it would remain the standard in the Catholic Church for years. And just to show you how long, Jerome did it in the 400s. And when I entered the seminary in 1959, we worked from the Latin Vulgate. We worked the Latin text. That's what we used in our class. Now, in the year 476, the Gothic tribes, remember we talked the Gothic tribes began to take over a lot of land? They proved to be extremely good rulers, and they reshaped entirely the Western Empire. So now, if we were to look back at the, if we want to call it the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, as it was much more visible in Constantinople. But in the West, it disappeared. And it disappeared under the thing of the Germanic tribes. It's one of the things of societies tend to develop as time goes on. And if you were to look at ancient Chinese society, probably the best example of that would be Tibet when I was a youngster, although Tibet today is much more like modern China. So the thing is, there are pockets in the world of societies that don't seem to evolve much, but they eventually disappear. So society evolves, and the Western Empire evolved. Eastern did not, and the Eastern Empire will disappear. The emperor, the Roman emperor in the West, regarded himself as both the emperor of the East and the West, although the emperor in the West had very little power, but he still considered himself the emperor of everything. The emperor in the East, I don't think, paid much attention to him. A young man who was named Theodoric went to Constantinople as a hostage ally at the age of 7. this idea of hostage ally is a very curious thing. But if two kings were at war, one of the things they would do as a treaty is, let's say France and England are at war. What they would do as a treaty is the King of England would send his children, not the heir to the throne, but his other children to France to study. And they would live in the palace with the French king and study there. And in exchange, the French king would send his children, not the heir to the throne, but his children, to England to be educated. And the idea was this, over a period of time, would build a continuity between the two countries because they've been educated as rulers with one another. And it would help to ensure peace. There's also the basic thing is, I'm not going to attack you if I know my children are going to be killed. So it became one of the ways of doing treaties. So he married this man Theodoric. He married one of the princesses of the emperor Zeno. And Zeno sent him to the west to retake, as an army, to retake these lands that the Germanic tribes were basically administering. So he went over to retake them. Theodoric eventually took the city Ravenna, and it was the new capital of the West. And when he took it over, he killed the emperor. He killed the emperor of the West. While he recognized Zeno in in Constantinople, Theodoric recognized Zeno as the emperor of everything. But Theodoric really ruled very independently. And he wanted to live independently and to actually reestablish the old Holy Roman Empire. Though he was an Arian, in the West, he gave complete freedom to the Catholic Church and allowed them to develop and go on. Under him, Italy went through a total rebirth in culture and art. And I don't know how many of you have ever been to Ravenna, but Ravenna, as a city, retains many of the buildings that came from that early period. And they're gorgeous buildings with great carvings on them and everything. But they're also very much like the East. They're the sort of things you would find in Greece. And remember, though, he came from that area. In Constantinople, the emperor decided to start persecuting the Arians. And Theodoric responded by persecuting the Catholics. So the emperor in Constantinople was Catholic. And Theodoric was, in fact, Arian. In 492, Pope Gelasius I, while he was still secretary to the previous pope, remember the secretary normally became pope, demanded that the emperor submit to the pope in all religious matters. As pope, he would clearly define the distinction between church and civil authority. The Pope had authority over the entire church throughout the world and the right to define doctrine and morals. And this is very important, that we understand the church being in charge of doctrine and morals and the government being in charge of civil order and that sort of thing. And there is a constant battle that goes on about that through history. An example in the United States is the Catholic Church has a very, very strong stand on abortion. And the Catholic Church used to have lots and lots of hospitals in the United States, and many small hospitals in little tiny towns and everything. But they were unable to get funds from the government. I think, the government reimburses for things like welfare cases and stuff like that. The government reimburses hospitals. But they were unable to get reimbursements through the government because they would not allow abortions. So many of the Catholic hospitals in the United States have disappeared. Some of them have gone into companies where they're basically the whole Catholic hospital originally, but they don't use the name Catholic. and they follow the civil laws. But there's an example where there's an overlap. And that's a difficult thing, but we recognize the authority of the Pope in faith and morals, the authority of the government in civil order. Justinian became emperor in the East. We're talking 527 now. And he worked to establish the principle of only one empire and one church. Now, one empire would mean he was the head of it, okay? And he is in Constantinople. He needed to strengthen his position, and he was almost overthrown in a riot in the year 532. His wife, Theodora, and incidentally, whenever you see paintings or mosaics of Justinian, Theodora is always there. And we believe today that Theodora was really the power that ruled through Justinian. So she wisely advised him to fight corruption in the community by raising taxes and the salaries of government workers, and to start paying subsidies to the neighboring countries to ensure peace. And this sort of calmed everything in the society. The society was very corrupt. People used their authority in order to get bribes, and that's how they lived. And the neighboring things were seeing the wealth of Constantinople, which I mentioned very early was a great trade center. So they saw the wealth of Constantinople, and they were constantly pressing on it. But what Justinian did was, first of all, raise the salaries of the people who were working for him, and secondly, he began to make subsidies to the surrounding countries so that there was no benefit to them attacking and destroying the source of these subsidies. And so he did ensure peace, brought peace about. In 511, Clovis became king of the Franks, that's in France. In Gaul, the church experienced huge dramatic growth under Clovis. And there was no need anymore of missionaries in Gaul because Gaul began to supply its own clergy. This was the first time that happened. Now, we saw in Rome and in some areas there were enough people coming into the church as clergy to supply clergy, but that was very rare. But under Clovis, that actually happened in Gaul. Common people were allowed to become priests, but the wealthy actually were much more likely to seek ordination. And one of the reasons was wealthy people historically have a greater respect for education. And the people who wanted to be priests had to go through this education with your pastor, not classes or anything, but education with your pastor. And so wealthier people tended to go more often in. Priests would be accepted by the bishop and then needed to be approved by the king. And the way this would work is that if I wanted to be a priest, I'd talk to my pastor, or if my pastor thought I would make a good priest, he would talk to me, and I would work with him over several years. And when he thought I was ready for ordination, he would ask the king. And if the king said yes, then accepted by the bishop and the king, then my pastor would present me to the bishop, and the bishop would present me to the king. And allowing that the bishop and the king approved, then I would be ordained. Over this period, the bishops became a very wealthy class. Now, remember I mentioned that wealthier people were going into the clergy at that time. So it isn't the wealth came from the church, but the wealth came from their families. And they were extremely wealthy as a community. Oftentimes they were from noble families, and many, many churches in France, even churches today that come from very old churches, were in fact built by wealthy bishops. They built churches from their own funds. Priests and deacons at this time adopted a distinctive dress. Now, the dress of priests and deacons has evolved over a very long period of time, but they adopted a dress that distinguished them in the community. And the distinguished dress, it remained distinguished even up to our own time, where the Roman collar largely distinguishes them. But it remained a distinctive dress, but it begins at this time. Priests were assigned to a parish at this time, and were not allowed just to wander around as preachers. They couldn't go off just preaching everywhere. And that's largely true today. Like as a priest of the Diocese of Monterey, I can be invited to different parishes in Monterey and can preach, but I can't really be invited to a parish, let's say in Spokane, Washington, without a communication between their bishop and my bishop allowing it. Well, this was the first time in history where priests were assigned to a parish and they were not allowed just to wander around. I hope you notice under this Clovis, notice how many of the changes we're watching right now become permanent in the church. The church was really formed society-wise very strongly at this time. At this time, only the Diocese of Arles in France was directly connected to the Pope. The rest of the dioceses were very independent until Pope Gregory in 573. Pope Gregory was very, very strong. But before that time, most dioceses were relatively independent. They would contact Rome and this sort of thing, but they did not feel the authority of Rome. Remember, the bishops were elected by the local clergy and approved by the king. So you didn't have the Pope appointing the bishops as we technically do today. Bishops were elected by the clergy. The king oftentimes would announce a preference, and that, of course, would greatly influence the vote of the clergy. But technically, they were elected by the clergy. Oftentimes, that office would be bought either through influence or by bribes. Remember, the bishops came from very wealthy families, so often the priests in the diocese would be bribed and vote for the choice. Property, once given to the church at this point in history, could never return to private hands. And that's an interesting thing because the church property was not taxed. We see that a remnant of that in the United States, where at least where the church building is on the property is not taxed. But in this time is the first time it began. The church property was independent, and it was not taxed, and it could never fall into private hands again. Now understand, there'd be no reason for church property to fall into private hands if in fact it can't be taxed, because it couldn't build up a debt or anything, so there's no way it would be lost. So church property was given this way. And the bishops began to serve also as political leaders. Remember that they were approved by the king. The king largely picked bishops who were of his own ilk and background. And so at this point in history, almost all the judges, in fact, were bishops. They were appointed as judges by the king, but he appointed bishops to do that. At this time also, pilgrimages became very, very popular. They began back when Constantine became emperor. His mother's name was Helena, and she went to the Holy Land and found the sites where the crucifixion took place, the birth of Jesus and that stuff. And as the world became more peaceful under the Roman Empire, then pilgrimages became very, very popular. And people traveled all over the world. Most of the world was Christian, and travel was easier. Rome and Tours became very, very strong places of pilgrimage. The original pilgrimage in the Catholic Church was Jerusalem. But now Rome, and in France, Tours. Tours because of St. Martin, who had been Bishop of Tours. And so these became things of pilgrimage. If you study in the Catholic Church today, the most important place of pilgrimage is Jerusalem. Second most important is Rome, and third most important is Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But when you begin to study pilgrimage in the Catholic Church, the goal of the pilgrimage is not so important. It's the process of the pilgrimage, what takes place to the person in making the pilgrimage. But I think it's curious that the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, that was our first pilgrimage, comes from the Jewish tradition. where they were required to go to Jerusalem for Passover. And if you go into the Muslim tradition, you also have the tradition of pilgrimage, but this time to Mecca. And so pilgrimage, I think both in the Jewish tradition and the Muslim tradition, is goal-orientated, Jerusalem and Mecca. But in the Catholic tradition, a pilgrimage is much more considered the process of making the pilgrimage, not so much where you're going. And I think any of you have ever read the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales are the story of a group of people on their way to Canterbury. There are many, many different places where they had pilgrimages. Monasteries now began to flourish all over Gaul. We're still talking France. They operated independently of one another, but each was under their respective bishop. So if a monastery was established, it was under the bishop. But the monasteries at this point themselves weren't related to one another. There was an Irish monk by the name of Columbanus, and he began a process of uniting the monasteries and organizing over them. He went to them and slowly influenced them, so the rule of Benedict eventually became the standard. And then he formed a union that protected the monasteries together. The monasteries were independent of their bishops, but part of this massive union. And monastic life is that way today, that if you go into a monastery, the monastery itself is independent of the bishop. But like the monks in a monastery, let's say the priests in a monastery, if they want to preach in any parish in the diocese, they need the permission of the bishop. But the bishop has no authority within the monastic community and the monastic property. Okay? And this was done largely to protect monasteries. What would happen is you would have a new bishop come in, and the bishop needed priests in his parishes. He could well order all the monks to go out and work in parishes. He could well change the rules in the monastery as to how he wanted it run. So in order to protect monastic life, this union was established at this time. And if I were to conclude this thing about Clovis, it is not possible to overestimate the power of the French church. The people in France were fiercely religious and loyal to the church, and they were following the example of Clovis. It's very interesting if you watch the history of France. Oftentimes, the French become very anti-clerical, like at the time of the French Revolution, but they remain loyal to the idea of being Catholic and being part of the church. That's happened in many societies, and it happened in France largely because of the corruption of the clergy at the time the revolution began. But oftentimes the corruption of the clergy has at different countries led to the fact that the people are anti-clerical, but they very seldom seem to turn away from the church itself. France, as a result of this, became known historically as the eldest daughter of the church. In 610, while the church grew in the Mideast, and many monasteries grew up there, the church never did win over the Arab tribes. So they converted a lot of people in Egypt in this area, and these people oftentimes, I think you remember that the beginning of monastic life was in the east. These people would go in the desert to live holy lives and everything. But we were never very successful in converting the Arab tribes. And there were much more nomadic tribes in that area than there were cities like Cairo and stuff like that. Much more nomadic tribes. The two biggest cities in the whole area were probably Damascus and Cairo. But the monasteries that grew up there, the religion that the the nomadic tribes had was polytheistic. They had many, many gods. Mecca at that time was a city, and there's an ancient structure in the center of Mecca that is the center of devotion for the Muslims. but it was a very ancient structure even at this time. And all these polytheistic tribes would go in and saw Mecca as the center of their worship. And each of the tribes had a god inside that building. There were all kinds of gods, polytheistic gods in that building. There were some small Christian communities, but they were monophysites. They did not believe in the Trinity. They believed in the one God, and the Spirit and Jesus were less. The major influence on this area was actually Syrian monks. Two things these monks introduced into the church. They introduced fasting and genuflection, and both those things have become very much a part of the church. Now, a young man by the name of Muhammad began to preach submission to one God. Now, Muhammad was influenced both by Christian and Jewish people that he knew. And if you look at the person, Muhammad himself, you find out that he was rather benevolent with both Christians and Jews in the formulation of his experience. His teachings were not really accepted by Christians and Jews, and I think that really surprised him, that he felt close to us and he felt that his inspirations and everything were in fact the next step after the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition. Then his was to be the next step in his mind. And he came to the conclusion that Christians were polytheists, and he based that on our belief in the Trinity. Of three persons in one Trinity, he thought we must believe in three gods. And that's largely held by the Muslims today, that we believe in three gods. And Christians, the religion first caught on in the city of Medina. Muhammad had a series of inspirations. He began to live a holy life and was recognized as a wise man, very much recognized as a wise man. But his thing of there being only one God was not very acceptable in Mecca, where he lived. And largely because the fact of all these gods being in that building was causing all these tribes to come in and go through Mecca, which was a great center of trade, so that stuff came from Persia and the east and stuff came from the west. It was a very powerful trade city, and they saw it connected to the religion of the tribes, because the tribes, remember, were the ones who did all the trading. They're the caravans. They carried all the goods around. So the people of Mecca became very upset, and Muhammad left. In the year 360, he became strong enough in his own community that he decided to march on Mecca, which is what he did. He conquered Mecca, and he settled there. One of the things he did, of course, was throw all the gods out of that particular building. And now remember, Mecca had been a center of worship for the tribes already. After the death of Muhammad, then the Quran was written. And the word Quran means recitation. It's something that is recited. It's a very curious thing. If you go to the Mideast, I was in Cairo one time, and I have a friend of mine who is a Coptic Catholic, and he said, you need to come in and listen to the Quran being read, because it is in fact a recitation. Now, I'd heard lots of people read the Quran, like if in in Istanbul, and there is a huge museum called Topkapi, and in Topkapi are the relics of Muhammad. His beard and things he owned and stuff are all in Topkapi, and that's because the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire looted Mecca and brought all that stuff to Topkapi. But if you ever go in there to look at the things, there's silence in the room, except that there's a gentleman there reading the Quran. And it's not It's not a very inspiring thing. It's just like listening to anyone read. It's just not very good. And it doesn't help, I guess, that it's in Arabic. But anyway, they do the reading. But anyway, I went to a recitation. So he took me to a recitation, and this woman came out, and she sat in a large stuffed chair. And when she sat down, she began to recite the Quran. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. It's very lyrical, it's very beautiful. And these recitations are very, very poetic. And in the Quran, they're seen as a huge value in the whole recitation. I think you know that one of the things that the Bible tells us, Paul says that faith comes through hearing, so that we believe that when studying Scripture, you're supposed to read it aloud too. Even if you're studying alone in your house, you're supposed to study it aloud. There's something about the sound of the Scripture. Well, they noticed that with the Quran, and the Quran essentially is seen as a recitation. Now, it's a collection of the sayings and the sermons of Muhammad and the revelations that he received from God. He had visitations, I think, from the angel Gabriel. An angel came to him anyway and gave him revelations that these all became a part of the Quran. These came together over a period of time in much the same way the gospel accounts came to be. And they were refined and finally codified to exist as the Quran today. And that took place very, very early. With the passing of Muhammad, then the faith was spread by conquest. And the faith initially, Muhammad did not spread the faith by conquest. Once the faith was spread, once he had a number of believers, he conquered Mecca, but he didn't conquer Mecca in order to force them to become members of Islam. In fact, when Muhammad conquered Mecca, he allowed both the Christians and the Jews to go on living in Mecca. He didn't turn them out or anything. He allowed them to stay, and they didn't need to become Muslim. And historically, when populations were conquered initially, there was not the force to become Muslim. One of the things that they did, if you were non-Muslim, you were taxed higher than the Muslims. But at the same time, you were forbidden to serve in the military. They were always afraid that the military would take over and impose another religion or something like that. So the religion in the military, there were nothing but people of the faith of Muhammad. And Christians and Jews played a slightly higher thing. But there wasn't the animosity. The animosity between Muslims and Christians grows entirely out of the Crusades. That's where we really see all of that happened. So the faith now is being spread by conquest, and probably there is no period in history when so much land was conquered so quickly by any group. The conquest was absolutely spectacular, and the new capital of this whole empire was made Damascus. Many of the oldest Christian communities came under Muslim rule. As you remember, that there's a strong Christian community in Egypt, a very strong one in Syria, and there are the remnants, like the remnant in Egypt is the Coptic Church, the remnant in Syria is the Syrian Catholic and the Syrian Orthodox Church. But the remnants of these early churches still exist in this area. In the early days, the Muslims, as I mentioned, were very tolerant of both Christians and Jews who were allowed to live peacefully in the empire. And while they did not oblige Christians or Jews to become Muslim, it is a law that no Muslim may convert to Christian or Jewish faith. And if they did, they were killed. And oftentimes, their family suffered as well. In fact, that's true, I know, in parts of Egypt even today, if someone converts. In the West, During exactly this same period, the Lombards, which were a tribe in Germany, took over much of Italy, beginning in the north. The difficulty was, again, they were Arians, and they were imposing restrictions on Catholics. In the year 590, the Lombard queen became a very close friend of the Pope, and she was highly instrumental in having the restrictions on Catholics lifted. And so thanks to her, the restrictions were lifted. In the year 590, she became this friend of the Pope. In Rome, a young man named Gregory, who happened to be the son of a senator and a rising civic leader, he left public life and turned his home into a monastery, became a monk, sort of established his own monastery. The Pope called him from the monastery to become the Pope's assistant. Now remember, this is the one who normally ends up Pope, and sent him to Constantinople as his representative. So the Pope sent Gregory, and he sent him to Rome, to Constantinople as a representative of the Roman Pope. When the Pope died, then Gregory returned home and became the next Pope. He tried to leave Rome and go back to his monastery, but was forced finally to become Pope. Gregory is, I would say, up to this point, probably after Leo the Great, then Gregory the Great, he'll be known as Gregory the Great, is certainly one of the most important popes in all of history. When we read the morning breviary, the priests, there is a scripture passage followed by a homily or a writing of a famous person or something. A remarkable number of those we use even today are by Gregory. He signed his letter, Servant of the Servants of God, and still that's the title that's used by the popes today, the Servant of the Servants of God. He sent missionaries everywhere that had been part of the old Roman Empire. Normally missionaries sort of looked where they wanted to go and this sort of thing, and they would take it and go. But Gregory didn't do that. Gregory saw the missionary effort of the church as the specific responsibility of the Pope. And he would look to areas where he thought they should go and send them. Now remember we talked about the diocese and stuff being independent? Well, these areas that were established by the missionaries that Gregory sent out were not independent. They were very loyal to the Pope. He's the one who sent St. Augustine to England, Augustine of Canterbury, and he converted England. And he personally centralized the power of the church in the hands of the Pope. Under Gregory, the Pope really assumes the power and the role that we see today. In Spain, there was a Visigoth king, and he converted to the Catholic faith away from the Arians. Now, he was Christian, but he converted to the Catholic position. And Spain became a great center of learning for the whole world. There's a man by the name of Isidore. Isidore of Seville wrote an Encyclopedia of Knowledge. I don't know if many of you remember when I was a youngster, we used to have a set of books called the Books of Knowledge or an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia really covered to some depth everything, so that you could look up physics, you could look up all these things. And it's very interesting that we would never attempt something like that today in one set of books or anything. There's too much about everything to know. And it's interesting, when I was a very young man entering the seminary, most people became priests. And who became priests, you became a parish priest, and you had a standardized education. And now, when guys come out of the seminary, we have the standardized education in the seminary, but when guys come out of the seminary, you'll find some focus on psychology, some on sociology, some on theology, some on morality, some on ethics, some on scripture. That they really become focused and become very, very independent in their fields. But education has just grown that way. In Ireland, monks spread the faith, and the monasteries became centers of learning. Now, notice that both in Spain and in Ireland now, education is seen as a very big part of being a member of the church. People were expected to be educated. Irish monks, incidentally, introduced private confession and frequent confession. Before this time, confession had been public. If you study immoral theology, it seems that they only considered 3 sins mortal. That was adultery, murder, and apostasy, which is leaving the church under a persecution or something. And so these were considered mortal, and they needed to be confessed. But these sins were very public. And when, in fact, the person would confess them, they would be confessed in public, and the person would be given a penance. The penance usually lasted all of Lent, and they were received back into the church on Holy Thursday, where they made communion again. And they would be absolved, and that's the way Sacrament of Penance went. They never allowed anyone to receive the sacrament twice, because they said that if you made your conversion to the church and then fell into sin, and then reformed and came back and then fell again, you obviously weren't committed to the community at all. And the sacrament at this time was known as second baptism, which emphasized the idea of you only receive it once. So this was going on. The Irish monks introduced 2 things. They introduced, number 1, you could receive confession more than once. And they went on the thing about Jesus, how often do you forgive people, that sort of thing. So they went on this, you could receive reconciliation as often as you wanted. And the second thing they did was allowed confessions to be private. You could go in and go to confession privately. And so this began a very big thing. This was condemned all over the church. All leaders all over the church condemned this. But the interesting thing is that at that time, every king, every royal court had their private chaplain. And every king in the world got an Irish monk as their chaplain, because then you could be forgiven as often as you wanted, and it would be private. So the practice spread independently of the authority and just became general throughout the entire community. In Constantinople, another movement began in the year 726 called the Iconoclastic movement. The Iconoclastic movement maintained that images, icons, and things like this were all to be destroyed. The Emperor Leo III, the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, ordered the destruction of all images. Now, probably the great influence of this is the Muslim community, which is against the representation of human beings in, in statuary and stuff like that, and the Jews, who were against the representation of carvings of people. But the Muslims, they didn't really allow paintings in most of the Muslim world. And so both of these things sort of influenced the the government in Constantinople. Constantinople had a very strong Muslim influence there because they were like an island surrounded by Muslim communities. And they had a strong Jewish influence because there were very well-educated Jews who participated and were part of the government there. So there was a young man by the name of John, and he came from Damascus. He was an official in the court of the Caliph in Damascus. Now, remember, Damascus at this time is the head of the Muslim world. So he was in the court of the Caliph. He was an official. He moved to Palestine and began to write a theology defending images. And finally, there was a compromise reached to end the destruction of images. It's a very interesting thing. And now, remember, this compromise affects only Christians. If you go into a a Eastern Rite Catholic Church. In an Eastern Rite Catholic Church, you will not see a statue. You will see bas relief. So there's figures carved into a wall, but you can't walk around them. You can do a bas relief, and you can do paintings like icons. Those were allowed. But standing statues, they decided no. And that's the compromise they worked out. And that compromise still holds in Eastern churches. Okay, I think we'll stop it there and pick it up with what's going on in Constantinople as the thing of the iconoclastic movement ends. Thank you very much.